The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of day that already felt worn and grey. For Elena, a single mother to triplets, it was a slap in the face delivered on thick, cream-coloured cardstock. Her ex-husband, Richard, a man who now lived in a world of penthouse views and tailored suits, was getting remarried. His name, embossed in gold, felt like a brand on her skin. He had invited her, he said, for closure. But Elena knew Richard. It wasn't an olive branch, it was a summons to her own public execution. He wanted to parade his new life, his new wealth, and his perfect new bride in front of the woman he'd left with nothing but 3 tiny mouths to feed. He wanted to see her crumble. What he didn't know was that in the ashes of the life he'd burned down, Elena had forged herself into something unbreakable, and she was about to attend his party. The 4th floor walk-up on the edge of Queens felt a world away from the life Elena had once known. Each morning, her world was a symphony of small struggles, the leaky faucet in the bathroom that dripped a constant, maddening rhythm, the chorus of "Mommy, I'm hungry" from 3 identical sets of lungs, the scent of stale coffee and baby powder that clung to the air like a second skin. Liam, Noah, and Chloe were her universe. Their tangled blonde hair, their scraped knees, their brilliant, innocent smiles. They were the reason she breathed. They were also the reason she was perpetually, bone-achingly exhausted. This life was her reality, a stark contrast to the silken sheets and sun-drenched mornings of her marriage to Richard Sterling. In those days, her biggest concern was which charity gala to attend, or whether the caterer had sourced the correct vintage of champagne. Richard, with his sharp suits and sharper ambition, had built an empire in finance, and she had been his curated first lady, the perfect accessory to his meteoric rise. She'd given up her architectural degree, her career, her very identity, to fit into the mold he'd created for her. And when she'd finally given him the one thing he claimed to want, an heir, it had shattered everything. The news of triplets had been a shock, but for Elena, a thrilling one. For Richard, it was an inconvenience. 3? He'd scoffed, the word dripping with disdain. Elena, this isn't a suburban sitcom. It's messy. It's common. He'd wanted a single perfect child to mold in his image, not a chaotic trio that would disrupt his pristine, orderly existence. His detachment grew into a chasm, and by the time the children were born, he was a ghost in their lives. The divorce was swift and brutal. His lawyers painted her as an unstable, grasping woman, and she, too broken to fight, had walked away with a meagre settlement that evaporated within the first year of diapers, formula, and rent. He kept the penthouse, the portfolio, the life they had built. She was left with 3 beautiful, screaming, wonderful babies and the crushing weight of starting over. The invitation felt like a cruel joke, a ghost from a past she was desperately trying to outrun. It was nestled between a final notice utility bill and a coupon booklet for diapers. The envelope was heavy, opulent, smelling faintly of a perfume Amelia, his fiancée, probably wore. Amelia Vance. Daughter of a rival titan in Richard's world, a woman whose photograph in the society pages always looked glossy and untouchable. Their marriage wasn't just a union, it was a merger, a consolidation of power. Elena's hands trembled as she sliced it open with a kitchen knife. Richard Sterling and Amelia Vance request the honor of your presence. The script was a swirl of gold ink. Below it, in Richard's precise, arrogant handwriting, was a personal note. Elena, I truly hope you can make it. It would mean a lot to me to have you there, to close this chapter properly and move on with no hard feelings. R. No hard feelings, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Every word was a lie, a carefully sharpened dart. He didn't want closure. He wanted an audience for his triumph. He wanted to see her walk into that grand ballroom, her clothes second-hand, her face etched with the exhaustion of single motherhood, and he wanted everyone to see how much better off he was without her. He wanted to disgrace her, to put a final, definitive stamp on her failure and his success. The power imbalance had always been his favorite drug. He thrived on knowing he had more, that he was more. She sank onto her lumpy sofa, the springs groaning in protest. On the floor, her toddlers were creating a fortress of mismatched blocks, their laughter echoing in the small apartment. Liam, the thoughtful one, carefully placed a block. Chloe, the firecracker, promptly knocked it down, squealing with delight. Noah, the gentle peacemaker, tried to pat his sister's arm in a gesture of comfort. They were so perfect. They were everything. Richard had never even bothered to learn which one was which. He saw them as a single, inconvenient entity. For 2 years, she had scraped by. She took on freelance drafting work, sketching blueprints for kitchen renovations and garage extensions in the dead of night, her laptop propped on a stack of books while her children slept. Every dollar was a victory, every paid bill a mountain conquered. But it was a life lived on the precipice of disaster, where a sick child or a broken-down car could send her spiraling into debt. She looked at the invitation again, at the gleaming gold letters. A slow, unfamiliar fire began to burn in her gut. It wasn't just anger. It was something colder, sharper. It was resolve. Richard had written her off. He'd cast her in the role of the tragic, pathetic ex-wife. He had built a gilded cage for her during their marriage, and when she no longer suited it, he had thrown her out into the cold. He expected her to arrive broken. He expected her to be ashamed. He was about to be deeply, deeply disappointed. The view from Richard Sterling's 80th floor office was, by any measure, magnificent. The entirety of Manhattan sprawled below him, a concrete kingdom glinting in the afternoon sun. To Richard, it wasn't just a view, it was a reflection of his own dominion. He was a master of this universe, a man who bent markets to his will and people to his whim. He adjusted his silk tie, the knot perfect, and took a sip of his Macallan 25. The amber liquid was smooth, but it did little to soothe the restless, gnawing thing that lived inside him. His fiancée, Amelia Vance, sat opposite him, her posture as impeccable as her Chanel suit. She was examining the wedding invitation, her finger tracing the gold embossing. Amelia was not a woman given to frivolous sentiment. She was sharp, strategic, and every bit his equal in ambition. Theirs was a partnership forged in the boardrooms of their respective family empires, a union that would make them the undisputed power couple of New York finance. "Are you sure about this, Richard?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of steel. She held up the invitation. "Inviting her? It seems unnecessarily dramatic." Richard swirled the whiskey in his glass. "It's called being the bigger man, Amelia. Closure. We were married for 7 years. It's the civilized thing to do." Amelia's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. She knew him too well for such facile explanations. "Civilized? Or a performance? You want her there so you can feel the victory more acutely, so you can see what you've gained against what she's lost." He hated how well she could read him. It was one of the things that attracted him to her and terrified him. "Don't be ridiculous," he snapped, his voice a little too sharp. "I pity her, that's all, stuck in some dreadful little apartment with them." He couldn't bring himself to say their names. The triplets, the chaotic, screaming embodiment of his life's biggest miscalculation. He had envisioned a dynasty, a single son to carry the Sterling name, a child he could mold. Instead, Elena's body had betrayed his vision, producing a litter. That's how he thought of them, a messy, inconvenient litter that had ruined the clean lines of his life. The truth was, his marriage to Elena had been a constant, low-grade humiliation. She was brilliant. When they'd met, she was at the top of her class in architecture at Columbia. A mind so sharp and creative it intimidated him. He'd fallen for that mind, but once he possessed it, he'd felt compelled to dull it. He encouraged her to quit her job, to focus on their social life, to become Mrs. Sterling. He needed her to be an extension of him, not a competitor. But even in her domestic role, her intelligence shone through in ways that pricked his ego. The way she could dismantle his arguments with quiet logic. The way his business partners were more captivated by her insights at dinner parties than his market predictions. He had needed to be the sun, and she was a competing star. Leaving her hadn't been enough. He needed to prove that her brilliance was nothing without his money, his name, his world. He needed to see her diminished. The stories he heard through the grapevine were delicious to him. Eleanor struggling with freelance work. Elena buying groceries with coupons. Elena looking tired and worn. Each story was a balm to his insecure soul. This wedding was to be the final act. He would stand at the altar, a king beside his queen, and Elena would be a peasant in the pews, a living testament to the fact that he was the one who had won. "She won't come, of course," he said with a confident wave of his hand. "She won't have the nerve. Or a dress that isn't from a thrift store. This is just a gesture." "I think you underestimate her," Amelia said, placing the invitation back on his polished desk. "And you overestimate your own subtlety. This isn't a gesture, Richard. It's a provocation. Be careful she doesn't respond in a way you're not prepared for." Amelia's motives were her own. Marrying Richard was a sound business decision. It would secure her position as CEO of her father's company and merge their assets into an unassailable fortress. She wasn't in love with Richard. She wasn't sure he was capable of inspiring love, but she respected his ruthlessness. What she didn't respect was this petty obsession with his ex-wife. It was a weakness, a flaw in his otherwise polished armor. It suggested an emotional fragility that could become a liability. She was marrying sterling capital, not Richard Sterling's unresolved insecurities. "I have it all under control," he insisted, standing up and walking to the window. He looked down at the city, at the thousands of lives playing out below. They were all just ants, scurrying along paths he could alter with a single phone call. Elena was one of them, insignificant. "She's a part of my past. This is about our future, Amelia. A future of absolute power." Amelia watched him, her expression unreadable. "Just remember, Richard," she said softly, "the past has a way of showing up when you least expect it, and it rarely arrives in the way you picture." But Richard wasn't listening. He was picturing Elena's face when she received the invitation. He imagined her quiet, weeping, her impotent rage, the soul-crushing envy. He saw her in a cheap dress, her eyes full of regret as she watched him slip a 10-carat diamond onto Amelia's finger. The image was so vivid, so satisfying, it almost felt real. It was a high he hadn't felt in years, a confirmation of his superiority that he craved more than any stock market victory. He was Richard Sterling, and he always won. The thought was so comforting, he failed to notice the predatory glint in his own fiancée's eyes as she watched him preen. She saw his weakness clearly, and like any good strategist, she was already filing it away for future use. The days following the invitation's arrival were a thick, suffocating fog of despair for Elena. Richard's calculated cruelty had worked, at least initially. She felt every ounce of the shame he'd intended. She looked at her worn-out jeans, the cracks in her apartment walls, the meager contents of her refrigerator, and saw them through his eyes, symbols of her failure. The temptation to curl into a ball and disappear was immense. She would throw the invitation away, pretend it never happened, and continue her life of quiet desperation. It was on a particularly bleak Friday, after a freelance client had rejected her latest drafts, demanding a complete rework without additional pay, that she hit her breaking point. With only $27 in her bank account and the rent due, she bundled the triplets into their rickety Tripl stroller and walked to the park, needing the open space to breathe. As the children played in the sandbox, she sat on a bench, her head in her hands, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She was so lost in her misery that she didn't notice the man who had stopped in front of her until he spoke. "Elena Petrova, is that you?" The voice was familiar, a warm tenor from a lifetime ago. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and saw a face she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Marcus Thorne. He had been 2 years ahead of her in the architecture program at Columbia, a whirlwind of creative energy and kindness. He'd been one of the few who had told her she was making a mistake by dropping out to marry Richard. "Marcus," she breathed, her voice raspy. He looked different, older, more confident, dressed in a stylish but casual blazer and dark jeans. But his eyes were the same, kind and intelligent. "I thought it was you," he said, a wide, genuine smile spreading across his face. His smile faltered slightly as he took in her appearance, the dark circles under her eyes, the palpable aura of exhaustion. "It's been a long time. I heard you married Sterling." The way he said the name was clipped, devoid of admiration. Elena forced a weak smile. "I did, and then I unmarried him. These are mine," she said, gesturing with a heavy heart toward the sandbox. "Liam, Noah, and Chloe." Marcus's eyes lit up as he looked at the children. "Wow, triplets. You always were an overachiever, Petrova." He crouched down, greeting the kids with a warmth that made Elena's throat tighten. He didn't see them as a burden or a mess. He saw them as children. They talked for over an hour. Eleanor, to her own surprise, found herself pouring out the whole story, the stifling marriage, Richard's cruelty, the brutal divorce, her current struggles. She even told him about the wedding invitation. She expected pity, but Marcus's expression hardened into something else, indignant anger on her behalf. "That's not closure, Elena. That's a public execution," he said, echoing her own thoughts. "He was always an insecure bastard. I never understood what you saw in him. Your designs, your vision. You were the most talented person in our program. You were going to change the skyline." Hearing those words, hearing someone acknowledge the person she used to be, the person she had buried under layers of being Mrs. Sterling and then Mommy, was like a key turning in a rusted lock. A part of her she thought was dead flickered to life. "That person is long gone, Marcus," she said quietly. "I draft kitchen extensions now when I can get the work." "No," he said, his voice firm. He sat beside her on the bench, his energy focused and intense. "That person is dormant. Listen, Elena, this might sound crazy, but I think this is fate. My firm, Thorne and Associates, we just landed the bid for the new riverfront development project. It's a massive undertaking, a sustainable mixed-use community. The lead architect on my team just left for a competitor, and I'm in a bind." He turned to face her fully. "The initial design proposals are uninspired. They lack a soul. They lack the kind of human-centric, beautiful functionality that you were known for. I remember your thesis project, that urban sanctuary design. It was revolutionary." Elena stared at him, her heart starting to beat faster. "Marcus, I can't. I haven't worked on a major project in a decade. I have 3 toddlers. My life is chaos." "I don't need you in an office 90 hours a week," he countered, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "I need your brain. Work from home, work after the kids are asleep. I don't care. I'll pay you a consulting fee, a generous one, just for your concepts. Draw up some initial sketches, give me a vision, something to shake up the board. Show me what that riverfront community should feel like." It was a lifeline, thrown from a ship she hadn't even realized was sailing past. It was terrifying. The thought of stepping back into that world, of competing, of having her ideas judged. It was overwhelming. But the alternative, sitting here, broken and broke, waiting for Richard's wedding day to arrive like a final nail in her coffin, was infinitely worse. "Why, Marcus?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you do this for me?" He looked from her to the children, who were now trying to pile sand on his expensive shoes, and he just smiled. "Because I've always believed that talent like yours is a terrible thing to waste, and because, frankly, I can't stand the thought of a bully like Richard Sterling getting the last laugh." He stood up and handed her a business card. "No pressure, Eleanor, but the project proposal is on our website. Take a look. If you feel that spark, call me. The meeting with the city planners is in 4 weeks. 4 weeks. The wedding was in 5. As Marcus walked away, Elena looked at the business card in her hand. Marcus Thorne, CEO, Thorne and Associates. It felt heavier than a simple piece of cardstock. It felt like a choice, a weapon. Richard wanted to see her as a victim. Marcus had just reminded her she could be a victor. She looked at her children, her beautiful, resilient children, and the fire in her gut, the one that had been flickering since the invitation arrived, roared to life. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to build a new world for them, one sketch at a time. And Richard's wedding? It was no longer a summons to her execution. It was a deadline. The 4 weeks that followed were a blur of frenetic energy, a resurrection fueled by caffeine and sheer, unadulterated willpower. Elena's tiny apartment transformed. The living room floor became a sprawling canvas of tracing paper, architectural sketches, and styrofoam models. The scent of baby powder was now mingled with the sharp, clean smell of graphite and ink. She worked with a ferocity she hadn't felt in years, rediscovering muscles in her mind that had long since atrophied. The first week was paralyzing. Staring at the blank page, her mind was a cacophony of self-doubt. Richard's voice was a constant, venomous whisper in her ear. "You're not good enough. You gave up. You're just a mother now." She would sketch a line, then erase it, her hand shaking. But then she would look at her children sleeping in their shared room, their chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, and she would find her resolve. This wasn't for her ego. This was for their future. She dove into the riverfront project, not just as a designer, but as a mother, as a citizen who understood what a community needed. She ignored the cold, sterile designs Marcus had shown her and started from scratch. She envisioned a space that breathed, green roofs that doubled as community gardens, a central plaza with interactive water features for children, pathways designed for strollers and wheelchairs, and housing units with flexible layouts for growing families. Her designs weren't just about steel and glass. They were about light, connection, and life. The architect she was meant to be was reawakening, and she was more brilliant than before because now she had lived a life outside the ivory tower. She called Marcus late one night, a week before the deadline, her voice a mix of terror and excitement. "I have something," she said. "It might be crazy." "Crazy is what I'm paying you for," he'd replied warmly. "Send it over." The next morning he called her back. He was silent for a long moment after she answered. "Elena," he said finally, his voice thick with awe, "this isn't just something. This is it. This is the soul. You didn't just design a development. You designed a neighborhood. I'm taking this to the board tomorrow." The board loved it. The city planners were ecstatic. Marcus called her with the news that her concept had been unanimously approved as the guiding vision for the entire multi-billion-dollar project. He offered her a full-time position as lead conceptual designer, with a salary that made her gasp and a flexible schedule that would allow her to continue working primarily from home. He also insisted on paying her an immediate, substantial bonus for the approved concept. "Genius," he said, "should be rewarded." The day the money hit her bank account, Elena stared at the number on her phone screen and wept. It wasn't just relief. It was validation. It was the sound of Richard's voice in her head finally going silent. With her new resources, her life began to change, quickly and quietly. She hired a wonderful, reliable nanny, a warm woman named Sophia, who the triplets instantly adored. She moved out of the 4th-floor walk-up and into a spacious, light-filled 3-bedroom apartment in a doorman building. Not on the Upper East Side, but in a family-friendly neighborhood with excellent schools. For the first time, the children had their own rooms. Watching them explore their new home, their laughter echoing off the freshly painted walls, was a joy so profound it physically hurt. But her transformation wasn't just external. With Sophia's help, she had time to sleep, time to think, time to remember who she was. She started exercising again, not to fit into a certain dress size, but for the strength and clarity it gave her. She bought new clothes, elegant, understated pieces that reflected her own taste, not Richard's. She looked in the mirror and saw not a tired, defeated woman, but Elena Petrova, a mother, an architect, a survivor. She was forging a new armor, not of wealth and status, but of self-respect and accomplishment. 1 week before the wedding, she walked into a high-end car service and booked a black Cadillac Escalade for the following Saturday. "I need the largest, safest car seats you can provide for 3 3-year-olds, she told the stunned agent, her voice clear and steady. Then she did the one thing she had been putting off. She went shopping for a dress. She didn't go to the designer boutiques Richard had once dragged her to. Instead, she found a small, independent designer with a shop in Soho. There she found the perfect garment. It wasn't a flashy ball gown. It was a stunning emerald green silk dress cut with the clean, elegant lines of a master architect. It was sophisticated, powerful, and utterly her. It was the color of new life, of money, of envy. As she stood in front of the mirror, the silk cool against her skin, she thought of the wedding invitation still sitting on her new marble countertop. Richard's intent had been to wound her. Instead, he had given her a deadline. He had inadvertently lit the fuse on her own revolution. He expected her to show up in rags, a ghost from his past. She planned to arrive as a vision of the future, a future he had no part in. A future she was building entirely on her own. The thought brought a slow, genuine smile to her face. The cage was gone. She was finally free. In the Sterling Vance universe, wedding preparations were less a matter of personal taste and more a matter of corporate-level event planning. Florists were flown in from Holland, a Michelin-starred chef was designing a 7-course menu, and the guest list was a carefully curated index of the world's financial elite. The wedding was the social event of the season, a coronation for the new king and queen of Wall Street. But beneath the opulent surface, hairline cracks were beginning to show. Amelia Vance was no fool. She had entered into this arrangement with Richard with her eyes wide open, viewing it as a strategic alliance. But his obsession with Elena was becoming a grating, unprofessional distraction. He brought her up constantly, veiled in dismissive, pitying tones that only highlighted his fixation. "I wonder what she'll wear. Probably something she sewed herself," he'd sneer over breakfast. "I had my assistant check her address. It's some dreadful part of Queens. Can you imagine?" He'd muse while they were reviewing seating charts. Amelia would simply nod, her expression placid, while inside her mind was calculating. This weakness of his was more profound than she'd realized. It wasn't just ego, it was a psychological wound, and he was picking at it like a child. A man this easily unsettled was a man who could be a liability. Her father, a ruthless patriarch who had built his empire on exploiting his rival's weaknesses, had given her one piece of advice. Know everything about the man you're marrying, especially the things he tries to hide. So Amelia did what she did best. She initiated a quiet, thorough investigation. She didn't use company resources but her own private network, a discreet firm that specialized in uncovering the well-hidden secrets of the powerful. She wanted to know everything about Elena Petrova's fall and, more importantly, if there was any sign of a rise. The initial reports were exactly what Richard had told her. A struggle, a small apartment, freelance work that barely paid the bills. But then, a month before the wedding, the data began to change. First, there was a large one-time payment to Elena's account from a Thorne and Associates. Amelia knew the name. Marcus Thorne was a rising star in the architectural world, a visionary who was snapping up major city contracts. A quick search revealed Thorne and Associates had just won the riverfront development project. Then came the change of address, a move to a luxury apartment building. A credit report showed new accounts being opened, a nanny service being paid, high-end purchases. It wasn't the portrait of a woman in ruins. It was the portrait of a woman on a sudden, dramatic upswing. Amelia sat in her office staring at the file. She could, of course, show this to Richard, but what would that accomplish? It would send him into a rage, an obsessive spiral that would make him even more unstable in the days leading up to their merger, their wedding. His focus would shift entirely to Elena, to this new, unexpected threat to his narrative of dominance. No, that wouldn't do. Instead, Amelia saw an opportunity. Richard's weakness could be her strength. His obsession could be the very thing that gave her the upper hand in their marriage from the start. She would let him walk into this blind. She would let him stage his grand performance, completely unaware that the lead actress had rewritten the script. The fallout would be his to manage, and in the chaos, he would be more dependent on her, more malleable. "Any news on whether your ex-wife is gracing us with her presence?" she asked him coolly one evening as they finalized the seating arrangements. Richard scoffed, moving Elena's name card to a table in the back, next to a drafty service door and near the kitchens, a final petty insult. "Still no RSVP. She's probably trying to decide if she can afford a taxi. Don't worry, my love. She'll either be a no-show, which is a win, or she'll come and make a fool of herself, which is an even bigger win." "And the children?" Amelia asked, a carefully neutral question. "What about them?" Richard's face soured. "She wouldn't dare. It's a formal affair. Besides, she probably can't afford a babysitter for one, let alone 3. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. Amelia felt a flicker of something close to contempt. He was so blinded by his own arrogance, he couldn't see the storm gathering on the horizon. He saw Eleanor as he'd left her 2 years ago, frozen in time, a static image of defeat. He was preparing for a battle against a ghost, while a living, breathing queen was plotting her arrival. She made a decision. She picked up Elena's name card from the Siberia table. "You know, darling," she said, her voice like honey. "It looks cruel putting her back here. People will talk. They'll say you're being vindictive." She moved the card to a much more prominent table, one near the front, with a clear view of the head table. "Let's put her here. It shows confidence. It shows we're truly above it all." Richard's ego swelled at the suggestion. Of course, it was a power move. To place his ruined ex-wife front and center was the ultimate display of unbothered superiority. "Brilliant, Amelia. Absolutely brilliant. Let her have a good view of what she lost." Amelia smiled, a perfect, serene bride-to-be. "Exactly, my love." She had just handed Elena a front-row seat to the implosion of Richard Sterling. It was a wedding gift to herself. The whispers at this wedding were going to be far more interesting than anyone could possibly imagine. And the most damaging lies wouldn't be the ones told about Elena, but the ones Richard had been telling himself. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, a perfect autumn day. In a penthouse overlooking Central Park, Richard Sterling woke up feeling like a Roman emperor on the day of a triumph. He'd slept soundly, his dreams filled with vague, satisfying images of victory. Today, he would consolidate his empire by marrying Amelia, and he would finally, publicly, erase the stain of his first marriage. He looked at his reflection in the mirror as he knotted his Tom Ford tie, confident, powerful, invincible. He felt a thrill of anticipation, the same he felt just before a hostile takeover. This was the final merger, the one that would secure his legacy. The thought of Elena, if she even dared to show up, was a minor, amusing footnote to his grand day. Across town, in a sun-filled apartment that smelled of pancakes and fresh coffee, Elena Petrova's morning was a study in controlled chaos. Liam, Noah and Chloe, dressed in adorable matching navy blue suits she'd bought for them, were chasing each other around the living room, their laughter a joyful, chaotic melody. Sophia, the nanny, was trying to simultaneously wrangle them and pack a bag full of toys, snacks and wipes. Elena, however, was an island of calm in the middle of the storm. She stood in her bedroom, looking at the emerald dress hanging on the door. It was more than a dress. It was armor. Every stitch held the memory of the late nights she'd poured into her designs, the courage it took to reclaim her life. This wasn't an act of revenge. Revenge was Richard's game, a bitter, corrosive emotion. This was an act of reclamation. She was not attending as Richard's ex-wife. She was attending as Elena Petrova, and she was bringing her entire world with her. "Are you nervous, honey?" Sophia asked, pausing at the bedroom door. Elena turned, a small, genuine smile on her lips. "I was, but I'm not anymore." "It's just a party, Sophia." But it wasn't, and they both knew it. It was a closing statement. "You look at the party people, Mommy?" Chloe asked, tugging on Eleanor's silk robe. Elena crouched down, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Yes, sweetie. We're going to go see someone Mommy used to know, and we have to be on our very best behavior, right?" "Right!" the three chorused, though Chloe was already trying to pull a thread from her brother's jacket. As Sophia took the children downstairs to wait, Elena began to get ready. She styled her own hair, letting it fall in soft waves over her shoulders. She did her own makeup, emphasizing her eyes, which were no longer shadowed with exhaustion but clear and bright. When she finally slipped on the emerald dress, it felt like a second skin. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger to the broken, weeping woman who had received that invitation 5 weeks ago. This woman was formidable. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "Thinking of you today. Remember, you're not walking into his story. You're walking into yours. Go change the skyline." His words were the final piece of steel she needed. She took a deep breath, grabbed her clutch, and walked out of her bedroom, the silk of her dress whispering with every step. Downstairs, the black Escalade was waiting. The driver, a professional and discreet man, held the door open as Sophia buckled the triplets into their car seats. The interior of the SUV was spacious and smelled of clean leather. It was a world away from the subway and the city bus. "I can take them to the park, Elena, if this is too much," Sophia offered one last time, her eyes full of concern. "No," Elena said, her voice firm as she slid into the seat. "They are the most important part of my life. He erased us. Today, we're going to remind him that we exist." She looked at her children, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. "And besides," she added, a mischievous glint in her eye, "they look incredibly handsome. It would be a shame to waste the suits." As the Escalade pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly into Manhattan traffic, Elena felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She was no longer a pawn in Richard's game. She was her own player, with her own pieces, and she was about to make a move he would never see coming. She wasn't driving to a wedding to prove a point to him. She was going to show her children that their mother was strong, that they should never be ashamed of who they are or where they come from, and that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to show up to their party looking like you own the place. The St. Regis Hotel was a fortress of old-world opulence, its grand ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and suffocating under the weight of thousands of white roses. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the low hum of powerful people making powerful conversation. This was Richard Sterling's natural habitat, a room where net worth was the only metric that mattered. He stood near the entrance, a triumphant smile plastered on his face, Amelia a vision of icy perfection at his side. He accepted congratulations, shook hands, and scanned the crowd, a part of him still looking for the ghost he'd summoned. He was beginning to think she hadn't had the nerve to come after all. A pity. The humiliation would have been exquisite. And then a subtle shift occurred at the entrance. The low hum of conversation faltered. Heads began to turn. A ripple of whispers spread through the room like a contagion. Richard followed their gaze, his smile tightening. A long black limousine, no, an Escalade, sleek and imposing, had pulled up to the curb. A liveried driver opened the rear door. Richard expected to see a late-arriving banking magnate or a tech billionaire. Instead, a single emerald-green silk shoe emerged. Then Elena. She rose from the vehicle not like a ghost, but like a goddess. The emerald dress clung to her form, a slash of vibrant life against the muted tones of the city. Her hair caught the light. Her face was serene and confident, and her eyes, when they briefly swept over the crowd, held not a trace of fear or shame. She was beautiful, but it was a different kind of beauty than the one he remembered. This was not the curated, polished beauty of Mrs. Sterling. This was the raw, undeniable beauty of a woman who knew her own worth. A collective, silent gasp went through the crowd. This was not the ruined woman from the gossip columns. This was a phoenix. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. His confident smile faltered, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. Amelia, beside him, remained perfectly still, but he could feel the sudden tension in her arm. She had known, or she had suspected. But the true shock was yet to come. After Elena emerged, the driver reached back into the Escalade. One by one, he unbuckled and lifted out 3 small children, all dressed in immaculate matching suits. 3 toddlers with the same blonde hair, the same wide, curious eyes. Triplets. They were not the messy, inconvenient abstraction Richard held in his mind. They were real. They were beautiful. They were undeniably his, and they were undeniably Elena's. She took their hands, 2 on her right, 1 on her left, and she began to walk towards the entrance. The 4 of them. A family, a complete, unbreakable unit. The sight was a cannonball to the hull of Richard's carefully constructed narrative. He had invited a beggar to his feast to mock her poverty. Instead, a queen had arrived with her heirs, not in a display of need, but in a display of a different kind of wealth. A richness of life he had discarded and could never get back. The whispers in the ballroom grew louder. "Is that Elena? My God, are those his children?" I heard he cut them off completely. "She looks incredible." Every word was a hammer blow to Richard's ego. He had wanted to be the center of attention, the victor on his throne. But in one breathtaking moment, Eleanor had stolen the entire narrative. She wasn't the tragic backstory to his glorious new chapter. She was the star of a much more interesting story, and he was suddenly a minor, villainous character in it. As she entered the ballroom, the crowd parted for her as if she were royalty. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't need to. She smiled warmly at a few familiar faces, calmly led her children through the sea of gaping onlookers, and found her table, the one Amelia had so cleverly placed front and center. She settled the children into their chairs, pulling small, quiet toys from her clutch for them to play with. She moved with an unhurried grace, completely at ease, as if she were merely having a Saturday lunch with her children. She was not performing. She was simply being, and her being there in all her unexpected glory was a louder statement than any screaming match could ever be. Richard stood frozen, his champagne flute clenched in his fist. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, watching his reaction. They were judging him. They were pitying him. He, Richard Sterling, was being pitied at his own wedding. Amelia turned to him, her voice a lethal whisper. "You said you had this under control, Richard. It appears your control has just walked in the door, wearing emerald green." He could feel his empire, the one built on perception and intimidation, begin to tremble on its foundations. The trap he had set for his ex-wife had just snapped shut on him. The air in the ballroom was charged with a tension so thick it felt like another guest. The string quartet played on, a frantic, cheerful sound completely at odds with the drama unfolding. For 20 minutes, Richard remained paralyzed, watching Elena from across the room. She was the picture of maternal grace, leaning down to whisper to one of her sons, laughing softly at something another one did. She was ignoring him, and the dismissal was more infuriating than any direct confrontation could have been. She was robbing him of his power by refusing to acknowledge it. Finally, fueled by a cocktail of rage and humiliation, he could stand it no longer. He muttered a clipped excuse to Amelia and strode toward Elena's table, a predator closing in on its prey. The whispers followed him, a wave of anticipation rippling through the guests. "Elena," he said, his voice a low growl as he reached her table. He had intended to sound intimidating, but a tremor of fury betrayed him. She looked up, her expression one of mild, polite surprise, as if noticing a waiter for the first time. "Richard, what a lovely party. The roses are a bit much, but Amelia always did favour spectacle." The calm, offhand critique of his wedding, delivered with the casual air of an art critic, threw him off balance. "What is this?" he hissed, gesturing vaguely at her, the children, the entire scene. "What kind of game are you playing?" "Game?" Elena raised an eyebrow. She handed Noah a toy car. "There's no game, Richard. You invited me to your wedding. I came. You never mentioned I shouldn't bring my children. My apologies if that's a breach of etiquette, but as you know, I can't afford a nanny." The lie was delivered so smoothly, so flawlessly, it was a work of art. It was a dagger coated in sugar. Richard's face contorted. "Don't play dumb with me. The dress, the car, Thorne. You're working for Marcus Thorne." He had made a few frantic calls just moments before. The truth had come crashing down on him. "I am," Elena said simply. "He values my work. It turns out my brain didn't atrophy when I became a mother. Imagine that." The children, sensing the tension, had grown quiet. Liam, the sensitive one, looked from his mother to the angry man, his lower lip beginning to tremble. "You did this to humiliate me," Richard accused, his voice rising. Elena finally dropped the placid facade. She leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a cold fire he hadn't seen in years. "No, Richard. You invited me to humiliate me. You wanted me to crawl in here, broken and ashamed, to serve as a backdrop for your glorious new life. You wanted to point at me and show everyone how far you'd risen. The only thing I did was refuse to play the part you wrote for me. This," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "is not my humiliation. It's a mirror, and you don't like what you see." It was at that moment that Amelia arrived, gliding to a halt beside her new husband. She didn't look at Richard. She looked at Elena, and for the first time there was a flicker of something other than icy composure in her eyes. Respect. "Elena," Amelia said, her voice smooth as silk, "I'm so glad you could make it. And your children are beautiful." She then turned her gaze on Richard, and the temperature dropped by 20 degrees. "Richard, darling, our guests are beginning to wonder why you're accosting a single mother and her children. It's a very bad look. It suggests instability." The word hung in the air, a public indictment. Instability. In their world, it was a death sentence, a sign of a bad investment. Richard was trapped. He was being outmaneuvered by both his ex-wife and his new one. He looked at Elena's children, really looked at them, and saw not just her defiance but his own discarded legacy. He saw 3 perfect little boys and a girl who would grow up calling another man Dad. He saw a life of warmth and laughter he was completely excluded from. In that moment, something inside him shattered. The arrogance, the pride, it all crumbled, leaving behind only the raw, gnawing insecurity that had been there all along. "Get out!" he choked out, the words barely audible. "Just get out!" Elena stood up, her movements deliberate and graceful. She gathered her children, who clung to her, sensing the battle was over. She looked Richard in the eye one last time, and there was no hatred in her gaze, only a distant, clinical pity. "Thank you for the invitation, Richard," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the now silent ballroom. "It was exactly the push I needed." She turned and walked away, her children in tow. The crowd parted for her once more, their faces a mixture of awe and sympathy. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't caused a scene. She had simply shown up as herself, and in doing so had systematically dismantled a powerful man with nothing but the truth. As Elena and her triplets walked out of the St. Regis, leaving the ruins of a party behind them, Richard Sterling was left alone in the center of the room, the spotlight he craved now a harsh, unforgiving glare. He was surrounded by his wealth, his power, and his perfect bride, and he had never felt so utterly, devastatingly poor. The consequences of his cruelty were just beginning. The wedding reception ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, catastrophic fizzle. As soon as Elena left, the atmosphere became unbearable. The guests, having witnessed the spectacular implosion of their host, made their excuses and began to melt away. The polite fiction of the grand celebration had been shattered, and all that was left was the awkward, ugly truth. Richard stood amidst the wilting roses and half-empty champagne glasses, a king in a rapidly emptying castle. Amelia approached him, her veil already removed, her face a mask of cold fury. "That," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth, "was the most humiliating public spectacle I have ever had the misfortune to be a part of. Our marriage, this merger, was contingent on an image of strength, stability, and power. You have shown yourself to be petty, obsessive, and emotionally volatile. You are a liability, Richard." "She planned it all, Amelia, can't you see?" he pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. "Of course she did," Amelia retorted. "She was provoked, and she responded with a masterful strategy. She didn't humiliate you, Richard. She simply held up a mirror and allowed you to humiliate yourself. My father will be hearing about this. Our lawyers will be in touch." She turned on her heel and walked out of his life, leaving him alone with the 7-course meal that would never be eaten and the string quartet that had finally fallen silent. The fallout was immediate and brutal. News of the disastrous wedding spread through the financial world like wildfire. Stories of his cruelty to his ex-wife, of the existence of the children he had abandoned, painted him as a monster. Deals that had been on the verge of closing were suddenly put on hold. Powerful allies stopped returning his calls. His power had always been built on a carefully crafted illusion of invincibility, and Elena had exposed it as nothing more than a fragile facade. In the cutthroat world he inhabited, a wounded predator is quickly devoured. Meanwhile, Elena wasn't reading the gossip columns or reveling in Richard's downfall. She had taken her children for ice cream after they left the wedding. As they sat in the park, their faces sticky and joyous, she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The battle was over. The chapter was, truly and finally, closed. Her redemption wasn't in Richard's suffering, it was in her own success. Her work with Marcus Thorne flourished. The Riverfront project became her passion, and her innovative, human-centric designs won awards and accolades. She was no longer Richard's ex-wife. She was Elena Petrova, one of the most exciting new voices in modern architecture. She had found her power not in tearing someone else down, but in building something beautiful and lasting. Months later, she was on site at the Riverfront development, watching the first foundations being poured. Marcus stood beside her, a proud smile on his face. Her children played nearby in a temporary safe play area she had designed for the construction workers' families. She had built a new life, a new skyline, a new future, all from the ashes of a past someone else had tried to burn down. She was no longer defined by the man who had left her, but by the world she was creating for her children. The limousine and the emerald dress hadn't been a costume for a single day of revenge. They were simply the outward symbols of an internal transformation that was real, profound, and permanent. The sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow on the rising steel structures, and for the first time in a very long time, Elena felt she was exactly where she was supposed to be, at the dawn of her own magnificent creation. Elena's incredible journey shows us that true power isn't about wealth or status, but about the strength you find when you have nothing left to lose. She didn't seek revenge, she sought redemption, and found it by rebuilding her life on her own terms. Richard's story is a powerful reminder that cruelty born from insecurity will always eventually be its own undoing. What did you think of Elena's grand entrance? Was Amelia a villain or just a strategist? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of betrayal and ultimate triumph, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories.